from the nation's point of view, you get a cohort and a reserve of partially trained, and they would only be partially trained individuals who at least would know how to lace their boots up and fire a rifle.
We return to the big talking point of the day. Rishi Sunak wants to introduce a compulsory year of national service for all 18-year-olds who can choose to take a full-time course or volunteer for one weekend a month. Just a few days ago, Andrew Morrison, the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of Defence, said the government had no plans to reintroduce national service, in part because compulsory service could, and I'm quoting here, damage morale, recruitment and retention. But in a time of increased global uncertainty and shrinking military, by 4%, by the way, between 2023 and 2024 to be exact, is a programme that encourages youth to get involved in the armed services really such a bad idea? Well, joining me now is a former Army officer and defence commentator, Stuart Crawford. Stuart, good afternoon. Thanks for giving us your time.
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me.
Stuart, just your thoughts on what you heard from the Prime Minister.
Well, I mean, I think it's fair to say that the devil will be in the detail, and until the Royal Commission, of which he spoke, looks at how this sort of scheme might be set up, we're slightly in the dark. What I think has been interesting is this sort of knee-jerk reaction from the usual suspects, and also from some people who should know better, because much of the media has presented this as being a return to national service, which for people of my age brings back a sort of collective memory of pimply youths in ill-fitting uniforms being bellowed at by red-faced sergeant majors in freezing Nissen huts in the middle of nowhere. And I think that is completely and utterly counterproductive, nor do I think that is the basic idea. I think there is, I can see the problems with it, but I think there is some merit in examining what is proposed further.
So I am curious as to why we had the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of Defence saying that actually compulsory service could damage morale and recruitment and retention. I mean, just practically speaking, Stuart, this idea that you'd get, and we believe that the number of places for the military would be limited to about 30,000. Now, around 700,000 people a year on average turn 18. So it's a different question of what everybody else does. But those 30,000 people that would come to the army for a year, how useful can they be?
Well, the answer is that in general terms, the old adage has it that one volunteer is better than 10 pressed men, or nowadays women as well. But 30,000 per annum is a sizable cohort. Mm-hmm. And at a time when recruiting and retention across all three services is having extreme difficulty, then it's something that needs to be considered. I think the important point here is that it wouldn't be compulsory military service. It would be compulsory public service. Yeah. And perhaps that would be a better name for the scheme, in which young people who perhaps had a tendency to the military might be able to choose to go into the military. And so therefore, they're not sort of reluctant recruits. They'd be sort of tentative recruits, if you know what I mean, dipping their toe in saying, I think I might want to be a soldier or a sailor or an airman, but I'm not really quite sure. And here's a year's opportunity to find out if that can be, if I'm right or wrong. From the nation's point of view, you get a cohort and a reserve of partially trained, and they would only be partially trained individuals who at least would know how to lace their boots up and fire a rifle, which would make the expansion of the armed services, should it ever come to national emergency, simpler.
Okay. Stuart, thank you so much for giving us your time. Fascinating to hear your thoughts on this. Stuart Crawford there, former Army officer and defence commentator. You've been looking at the fine print. The figure of just over £2 billion has been bandied about in order to fund the scheme. Where's the money going to come from?
Right, so obviously every party going into this manifesto will want to be able to say that their manifesto is fully funded. There'll be a lot of debate about what that actually means, but it does mean that for a scheme like this, parties will be expected to earmark funding. So 1 billion of this will be coming from cracking down on tax avoidance, which is something that all parties do going into an election. There's always a debate about actually how much you can raise through doing that. All governments want to minimize tax avoidance. The controversial bit is the remaining 1.5 billion, they say, will be using funding that comes from what they call the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. And it's quite important to sort of understand the chronology of this. So when the UK was a member of the European Union, it received funding from the EU under what were called structural funds. Obviously, the UK had paid into the EU first. These were funds that go to all member states, depending on sort of need and sort of indices of regional deprivation, effectively to pay for things like youth training schemes, lots of infrastructure, bridges, concert halls. So if you drive around the UK, you'll come across places, typically in poorer areas, lots in sort of Wales, Scotland, north of England, that have been paid for by EU structural funds. Big promise to the Vote Leave campaign is that these would remain. That no area would lose out on funding as a result of Brexit. So Boris Johnson's government created a successor to these EU structural funds called the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, funded by the UK taxpayer, UK Treasury directly, rather than going up to Brussels and then back down again. What this is saying is that actually this fund will be closed only after 6 years of operation. So it came into force in 2022. In 2028, that funding will be directed into paying for this national service scheme, effectively. Now, James Cleverly, the Home Secretary, was on the TV shows today saying that that's entirely consistent because this is effectively a form of levelling up, in that it's providing training for young people and improving their life chances, which you can make the argument. It's make the argument it's not going to be bad for people's life chances. People might learn stuff, but I think it's quite important to keep the focus on the original idea of the EU structural funds, and the spirit of the original UK Shared Prosperity Fund was the word productivity, right? So the whole point of these programs was that you would increase the GDP per head, improve the wages, the living standards, the economic activity of areas where these funds were directed. I kind of think it's quite hard to make a case that national service volunteering 1 weekend a month for 18-year-olds actually is necessarily particularly productivity enhancing. They might learn stuff, it might help them a little bit in their careers, but it's not the same as building a bridge or redeveloping a commercial centre in the way that the original funds were often did.
Do you have any inkling as to how different this is to, for example, what David Cameron had suggested? I believe it was called Cameron's National Citizen Service. It was set up by the Conservatives in 2010. It was the central plank of that big society vision. Is this very different?
It sounds relatively similar, right? And it's unobjectionable. I don't think anybody really objects to programs that provide opportunities for young people, particularly from backgrounds that don't necessarily have access to lots of these sorts of schemes to get people volunteering or engaged in structured programs, including perhaps an element with the armed forces. It does sound quite similar actually to Cameron's National Citizen Service, which he was certainly very proud of. I believe, I'd have to check this, I believe that its funding was actually reduced relatively recently. What I find fascinating, the politics of this, is that all this stuff sort of gets branded national service to create a memory perhaps amongst some voters of national service in the 1950s and the early Cold War, perhaps because that brings a sense that it's sort of bring discipline to wayward young people. It doesn't actually sound very much like national service in the 1950s at all, because that involved sort of young people being sleeping in barracks for a year and marching around parade grounds and being shouted at and learning how to do bayonet drills and prepare for war with Russia. And it was folded actually in the early 1960s because it was the military services realized that it actually wasn't what they needed to be prepared for modern conflict. They like professional armed services rather than 18-year-olds being dragooned against their will. But it's quite interesting that cultural memory of national service, it clearly has appeal for people, even when you're proposing a scheme which actually is much more like a Duke of Edinburgh scheme or something like that.
Well, and also quite interesting, it's doing the rounds on social media at the moment, but in Parliament on the 23rd of May, so a few days ago, Mark Pritchard, Conservative MP, asked Andrew Morrison, who's the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of the State of Defence, whether or not the Ministry of Defence had looked at the potential impact of the reintroduction of national service on national security. And just to summarise Andrew Morrison's reply is it would be, well, I don't need to summarise, here is his words. They're saying that it could damage morale, recruitment and retention, and would consume professional military and naval resources. So sort of the government sort of saying only a few days ago that compulsory national service is actually detrimental to the armed forces.
Yes, so I think he goes on to say or intimate that the nature of modern warfare, modern armed forces, means that you need an increasingly professional army, an increasingly sort of technically adept army, and not sort of 18-year-olds tribuned against their will. But it just goes to show actually that when you use the term national service, people mean very, very different things.
Means different things to different people.
It does, but it's clearly all the evidence is that when you poll this, it's for at least some voters, the voters of the Conservative Party are trying to speak to, it's very powerful. One thing I do think is quite interesting though is that democracies everywhere, particularly in light of COVID and in light of the invasion, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or reinvasion of Ukraine rather, are talking about sort of resilience, and do they need to be able to basically call on society to respond in the way that people responded during COVID, to organize vaccinations and things. And the government's been doing quite a lot of work in that area. And actually on election day morning, there was a really interesting speech by Oliver Dowden talking about this and the preparations they're doing to basically create networks of volunteers and people with skills, right? People medically trained, or people who've worked in local government planning, that sort of thing, to be able to step up in the event that something goes wrong. That's a really interesting piece of work. It's actually quite different to this, so it's just goes to show, I guess, the importance of precision in this debate about what actually we're talking about, rather than it does. The reaction on Twitter goes to show how whether people are wildly in favour of this or wildly averse to it. It really does touch some sort of cultural buttons, I think.
Yeah, and we're going to play it a little bit later on in the show. Rishi Sunak has put out a TikTok video now where it has to clarify what this all means. I think his first line is, just to be clear, I'm not sending everyone to the army.